established Christian doctrine. And what goes for science clearly goes for history and geography too. The view which I have been putting forward seems to entail the view that God inspired some passages of Scripture which would have been understood at the time of their first inscription as endorsing a view of God and human conduct which we now recognize as clearly immoral. Would God really have inspired not merely passages which, as then understood, contained false science or history or geography, but a view of God as savage and vindictive, for example, Psalm 137:9, or the affirmation attributed to God that he will punish children and grandchildren for the sins of their parents, or the command to the Israelites that when they entered Palestine, they should annihilate all its Canaanite inhabitants. Even if a later generation could get a deeply religious message from all this, would this justify the apparent deception involved in such inspiration? That is the objection, and we've heard it often at this conference. In response, I have three separate points to make. The first is, since there is no one human author of any passage, there's the first author and the first person who compiled it into a larger unit and the person who put that into a yet larger unit and so on. Since there is no one human author of any passage, the doctrine of divine inspiration is not committed to any view about which authors of any passage were inspired. Was it those who wrote down the original pericope, or those who incorporated it into some larger unit which could give it a different sense? The smallest unit may not have been inspired at all. Maybe the inspiration came to the compiler of some larger unit to use it in the context which would give it a different meaning from its original meaning. And even in the context of other contemporary parts of the Bible, individual verses cannot be construed in the same sense as in a small unit. At the very same time as Psalm 137 must actually have been written, Jeremiah wrote his letter to the Jewish exiles in Babylon, telling them in God's name, quote, to seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and to pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. If the Jewish exiles treated both works, contemporary works, as inspired, they, not merely we, they would not have been justified in taking Psalm 137 as having the simple message that it would seem to have as an isolated text. So that's my first point. My second point is that, as the fathers recognized, there is a principle of accommodation. Novation wrote with respect to attribution to God of bodily emotion, quote, the prophet was speaking about God at that point in symbolic language, fitted to that state of belief, not as God was, but as the people were able to understand. And this principle may be applied to moral instruction as well. There are certain moral truths which a primitive people are too primitive to grasp, or at any rate to continue to hold. One of these truths may be that while individuals may well suffer in consequence of the sins of their parents, since God gives to parents responsibility for their children, and wrongdoing by parents often has bad consequences for the children. Although individuals may suffer in consequence of the sins of their parents, the children have no guilt for the sins of their parents. Maybe this subtle distinction between suffering in consequence of and being guilty for was beyond the capacities of the first recipients of Exodus chapter 20, with its attribution to God of the intention to punish children for the sins of their parents and grandparents. Later parts of the Old Testament emphasized very firmly that children are not guilty for the sins of their parents. Jesus, too, recognized that Moses, speaking on God's behalf, was limited in how strong a message he could give to ancient Israel. Jesus prohibited all divorce, with one possible exception, whereas the Pharisees pointed out Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce his wife. Jesus responded that Moses only wrote this commandment because of their hardness of heart. We've talked about this previously in this conference, but it's an old principle. Innovation states it, principle of accommodation, well recognized by all the fathers, that there's a limit to the message you can get home to an ancient people, and for that reason, we must bear that into account in understanding how God deals with these people. But if primitive people could not learn many moral truths, why did God make primitive people? And we've talked about that before, but I re-emphasize the point that it's good for peoples to have the opportunity to work out things for themselves, even if they need and get quite a bit of help from God in due course. So while the inspiration would only have been very limited, and we cannot ascribe the status of revelation without error to the way the text was originally understood, I suppose it plausible to suppose that God inspired the writing of biblical books, some part of which, as originally understood, have an inadequate morality, which were capable of being understood as time progressed in a far deeper way. My third point is to suggest that while a lot of the things God is said in the Old Testament to have done would have been very wrong for anyone other than God to do, and many of the things which God is said to have commanded would have been very wrong for anyone else to do unless commanded by God, many of these, not all, many of these are ones which God had the right to do and command, and which he has good reason to do and command. I'll just concern myself with God's right to command actions, and I'll illustrate my view by repeating, and it will be repeating, something we've said earlier in the conference, but it's worth making the point at this stage. I will illustrate my view by considering the contention of various Old Testament books that God had commanded the Israelites when they entered Canaan to kill all the Canaanites. While there are surely necessary truths independent of the will of God, such as the obligation not to lie and the obligation to keep promises, except perhaps under exceptional circumstances, one of these necessary truths, independent of the will of God, is that people have a duty, within limits, to please their benefactors. God is our supreme benefactor. Pleasing a benefactor involves obeying his commands. If God is our creator, our life comes as a temporary gift from him, and he can take it back when he chooses. If A has the right to take something back from B, A has the right to allow someone else to take it back for him. If A is God, he has the right to command someone else on his behalf to end a life. God, therefore, has the right to order the Israelites to kill the Canaanites. God's reason for issuing this command, according to the Old Testament, was to preserve the young monotheistic religion of Israel from lethal spiritual infection by the polytheism of the Canaanites, a religion which included child sacrifice and cultic prostitution. Such spiritual infection was without doubt a very real danger. When monotheism had become more deeply rooted in Israel, such an extreme measure was not, according to the Old Testament, required again. It was a defensive measure necessary to preserve the identity of the people of Israel. While the Israelites would not have had the right to take this extreme measure without the explicit command of God, he did have the right to issue that command. God surely also had a reason for using the Israelites rather than the natural measures, such as disease, to kill the Canaanites, which was to bring home to the Israelites the enormous importance of worshipping and teaching their children to worship the God who had revealed himself to them and no other God. Even today, and without a divine command, many people would think it justified to kill people who had an infectious lethal disease and refused to be kept isolated from the rest of the population. Those who think that an infection which leads to spiritual death is as bad as an evil as one which leads to natural death will think that there are reasons, though not of course adequate reasons, for the Israelites to kill the Canaanites even without a divine command. I give this as an illustration that deeper reflection on God's right and reasons to command actions may lead us to recognize more inspiration by God of the early Israelites than we at first sight are inclined to recognize. Bearing these 3 points in mind, which were defensive points against someone who said, well, even if the Bible can be construed in a certain way later, then why did God allow people to have these texts and misunderstand them at an early stage? These were, as it were, minor defensive points at the end of my paper. The main point of the paper is to illustrate that you can interpret the Bible in many different ways, but the only way in which Christians have any reason to regard it as a revealed text is as a whole book, and in the sense and with the way of interpretation with which the Church commended it to us when it formed the corpus in the 4th century. And it's that which alone can claim truth.